Hey, hello there. Welcome back to part 3 of rebuilding Linear's website, where we are rebuilding every little detail the Linear website brings. And trust me, there's a lot of little details in there. Making this part 3 took me a little bit longer than expected, but I hope from now on again to make a little bit more regular updates on this, and I guess like 3 or 4 more of these videos until we have built the full homepage. So, be ready for the next one. First, let's have a quick look at what we built last time so we know where we left off. Last time, we mainly focused on building the homepage hero component, which you can see here with a nice title, but also, let me quickly refresh, also with this very nice animation. I mean, these details, it's super nice, right? And especially if I quickly open my inspector, the animation only triggers when the component gets into view. So only if we now scroll down, the animation gets triggered, and that's super nice. So that's what we built last week. And this week, if we quickly switch over to Linear's website, this week we are going to focus on everything underneath it. We're going to rebuild this logo section. We're going to rebuild this, I don't know, Planet Earth, perhaps, with all of the stars above it. It looks really nice in my opinion. And we are gonna work on these 4 blocks down below. We're mainly gonna set up the base structure for the top left one and bottom right one. And the other 2 we are gonna build fully because there's so many details in this again that it will take us quite some time to build them. So expect us to build the smaller icon versions. And in the next video, we will focus on the other 2. So without further ado, let's dive into it and start building. The first thing we need for this is making sure we have all these logos, which are SVGs. And I won't bore you to death looking at me copying all of these SVGs. So let's speed up that process. All right, so those are added in. Let's create a new component, which we call clients, which I think makes the most sense for this component. So that's also export const clients, and that will, in a second, return our text. Let's first add this component into our homepage so we can see what we're building. I am actually on purpose not adding the container inside a client component, because I think any components you make, you should be able to put anywhere on the page. So that means that they should not have any wrapping that puts it in the center of the page or any margin or padding on top of itself, because usually that margin and padding is really specific to the place you're currently putting it. So in my opinion, those wrapper components that give margin or padding to a component that are not used everywhere should be implemented in a page instead of on the component level. So that means that we're going to add a new container here. And in there, we are going to import our clients component. And we also need to wrap this in a React fragment because we can only have one top level child. And I'm going to rename this to clients instead of client, which makes a lot more sense. Okay, let's first copy in the right text and add a line break in here. And I'm also already gonna add all the logos in, so we have something nice to look at. As for the logos, by the way, I added them in components logos as React components, because this way, if they are a React component that we can put directly in the page, we can style them with CSS. And by, for example, setting fill to current color, which the Linear team actually already did, but by doing that, it will actually use the text color as a fill. So if we set the text color to white, then all the icons will be white. But if down the road we would use them in a different place where they need to be black or purple, we could simply change the text color without the need to change the SVG or add any props to that SVG. If we would use them as an image, that would not be possible at all, because then CSS cannot influence the SVG image. So back to adding in those logos. Beautiful. Now let's give them the proper sizes. We can do that by making for the wrapper first display flags, which will put them all on the line. But looking at Linear's website, they should be divided over 2 lines, as well as we see that all of them have a width of 160 pixels, or a max width in their case. So let's add that in first. We can do that for every SVG by targeting an arbitrary value. And we're actually gonna add a width instead of a max width. And we're gonna add flex wrap to the wrapper div. And by adding that, we're actually telling Flexbox that it should not keep everything on one line, but as soon as something is overflowing, it should actually move it to the next line, which is what you see happened just now. Also, all of these logos have a gap of 24 pixels. So we can use the gap property with gap 6 to also give it 24 pixels of gap. And that will make sure that there is the spacing between all the items, but not on the outside of any item. And actually, I now see there is a gap of 24 pixels on the x-axis, but 32 on the y-axis. So instead of using gap, we should use gap x as 6 and gap y of 32, which is 8. And if we check their responsive behavior, then let's see what happens. And that's why they use the max width, because they size them down until they're overflowing to the next row. So if we turn our width into max width as well, you actually see that they keep on overflowing to the next row. And that is because I've decided to use Flexbox instead of CSS Grid. And since we didn't define a specific amount of items that should always be on the row, like you can do it with CSS Grid, it is actually gonna keep the max width they can have, which is 160 pixels, and just overflows to the next row. However, I'm not really a huge fan of using CSS Grid for things that aren't really a grid. Of course, we can argue whether this is a grid or not, but in my opinion, I usually use Flexbox for most of the things. And I want to show you right now how you can also achieve this with Flexbox. Because what you can use for this is flex basis, and flex basis sets actually a size of the element that it should have. So in this case, we can, for example, use SVG and then basis, and then Tailwind has a few baked in ones, but we can also use arbitrary value again. And in this case, we can set that to 16.66% because we want to have 6 elements on a row. And if we divide 100 by 6, we get 16.66667. But as you can see, nothing has changed yet. And that is because we also should take into account the spacing that is between all the elements, the gap that is. And the gap is 24 pixels on every line. But again, it's only added in between all of the elements. So if we have 6 elements, that means we have 5 gaps. So that means that we have 5 times 24 is 120 pixels of gap. And that should then be divided by 6 elements. So if we divide it by 6, we get 20 pixels of additional spacing. So instead of being 16.66 in width, they should actually be 16.66% minus the 20 pixels. So if we add a calc around here and then add a minus 20 pixels, we suddenly see that all of them fit on the line again. And if we now resize this down, everything scales because it will be 16.66% instead of being full width with a max width of 160 pixels still. And then this should actually only apply from a certain breakpoint and up. So if we look at Linear's website, we see that when we make things smaller, that they will only show 2 in a column. And there's actually quite a few dropping off as well. We can fix that in a second. So we can do that by adding this flex basis only from medium and up. Because if we then go smaller, you see that they drop off again. However, in our case, we're still showing 3 on a row because it seems to fit on this breakpoint. Let's see if they did not make the logo bigger. So the logos themselves are still 160 pixels, but only added 2 columns in here. So what we can do is also add a flex basis as a default, where the items become 50% and then minus 12 pixels because we have only one gap that's 24 pixels divided by 2 equals 12. And we should space in here. And as soon as we do that, you see that we're still having 3 items on the line. And that is because we still have the max width applied to all of those SVGs. If we would remove the max width, then the SVG would scale up. So that's not the desired effect. And if you look at Linear's website and we inspect that SVG, you see that it has not grown beyond its max size of 160 pixels. But as soon as we inspect the wrapping div, you see that there are these boxes drawn around the SVG. And that is now one of the powers of CSS Grid, actually, because CSS Grid can define a fixed number of columns, but it does so without scaling the contents of the items. So instead of scaled up, they're actually simply centered within their respective columns. We could recreate this with Flexbox, but that would mean we need to have a wrapper div that can actually scale up and then have the SVG centered within that div. So instead of rebuilding everything towards CSS Grid now, because I just seen this behavior right now, I'm actually gonna leave it as Flexbox. So you have 2 different ways of almost doing the same thing. But if you really wanna achieve this design, it will become hard with Flexbox if you did not want to add in either the wrapper div or if you did not want to change to CSS Grid. One thing I do notice is that they align the SVGs within the center of their column on mobile. That is actually a pretty straightforward thing to do by adding justify around, which centers them in the center of the available space they have. And if we now go smaller, you also see that we go to 2 columns because now they're smaller than their max width of 160 pixels and they're still centered on the page. So even though this is not 100% accurate to what Linear has built, I'm actually going to leave it like this to have a different example of almost solving a similar problem. We do, however, still need to drop off a few logos when we're going to mobile. And for that, we need to be able to pass in class names to these SVGs. So I'll quickly add that as a property to all of the components. Okay, that was the last one. And what I did is I added in the props class name as well as the type definition, and then also added the class name to the SVG. And with that, we now have the option to add in a class name in here of hidden and block from medium and up. And that needs to be added to all of the logos that should be hidden on mobile. Okay. And after we've done that, we should see that there's less logos on mobile. And as soon as we go to desktop, that all of them appear again, which is correct. Cool. Next up is making sure that we add in the right text styles, which is 18 pixels on mobile, which is our text large. So we add that in, and if we scale up, it becomes 22 pixels, which is our text extra large. And then it is a color white. And there's this top part of the text that is actually a gray color, which is the primary text color. So that means we can add a span in here and give it a class name of text primary text. And then we also still need to center our content and not make a typo, of course. And make sure that we add some proper spacing around this component as well. As a margin bottom of 48 pixels on desktop. And the same goes for mobile. So that is a margin bottom of 12 then. And I also see that on mobile, they remove the line break again. So we can do that as well by adding hidden and block on medium. And that way, if we go smaller, you see that the line break does not appear anymore and the text just flows naturally on the same line. What we also still need to implement is this padding bottom of the wrapper for the hero. It has a padding bottom of 256 pixels on mobile. And when we go up, it has a padding bottom of 420 pixels. So let's add that into our wrapper div here. That has the overflow because this way the gradient glow will continue in that div. So that means a padding bottom of 25.6 REM and on medium and up. I forgot again. 420 pixels. Okay, and that also means that we can remove this padding Y and make it padding top only, because otherwise that would add 64 additional pixels of padding to the bottom. And I also feel that it's quite a lot of padding. And now I'm looking at it, I see that they guess do some sort of negative bottom margin, 164 pixels. So not sure why they're doing that. Probably so the glow extends underneath this text as well, but it doesn't seem to extend that far even. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to subtract the 164 pixels and on mobile 92. So that means 256 minus 92 is 164. And on desktop, it becomes 420 minus 164 is 256. And now the space at the bottom is similar to Linear's website. And I don't see any overflow clipping of the glow, so I don't think it's necessary to have the negative top margin. I mean, we're building it the way we like it, right? Not the way Linear coded it, because then you could simply look at their source. Okay, that actually wraps up the logo part. So the next thing we have to build is this really nice glow, almost like the sun coming up over the planet illustration. It's kind of in between of these two components. So I think it's really part of the homepage and it's not part of any specific component, because what it also does is it adds negative margin of 128 pixels to both the top and the bottom to pull the content in a little bit. If we would add that into a specific component, it would again make it really hard to use this component in any different place. So that's why I think it would be good to add this as a component specifically in this page. So if we inspect this SVG that's in the background, we see that it's actually a lot of small circles, many of which actually aren't visible, but okay. So we have to copy in that SVG in order to replicate this. I'm going to call this stars illustration. And it's, wow, it is a huge thing. Looking at this illustration on the website, really wondering if they're using this to the full extent, because it's so much. But I'm not gonna bore you right now with performance or anything like that, although it's fairly similar. So gzip will already improve this a lot if you load this, but still, it feels like a huge SVG for, I don't know, how many stars can you see? Maybe 30? But there's way more in here. Interesting. Unless it like parallaxes or something, it doesn't seem to. Weird. Oh well, we leave it like this for now. We're gonna add a div in here where we're gonna import this stars illustration for now. And that also helps us, yeah, in seeing how many stars. I don't know anything about the universe, but is it kind of the Milky Way, maybe? I don't know. Or the stars in our solar system we can see from planet Earth? I don't know, but It's cool that they did it if it's some kind of reference. So they added a height of 600 pixels to this div and an overflow of hidden, as well as that negative margin of minus 128 pixels. So let's also add that in. And that for now destroys everything, of course, because we don't have the proper padding. So let's leave that out for a second. Oh, and this should be 60 REM, which is probably already part of the reason why it looks so awful. Yes, it's better. Okay, then we can leave the negative margins in for now. And next to the illustration, they also added two pseudo elements. One with a radial gradient and the after element with a border. Oh, it's this rounded border probably. Yeah, nice. Really well done. So let's add both of them in as well. And since this is so specific, we're kind of copying linear right now because it's hard to come up with something that's different than this if we want to have the exact same result. I am though going to use the class names package again so we can add the before and after properties on multiple lines for readability. So first we're going to import the class names and then we're going to move this to a new line. So we can add the before, which has a position of absolute and it has an opacity of 40%. And then it has this background gradient, which I'm actually going to do a little bit similar to what Linear is doing. They're using a variable to set a color, and that makes this gradient reusable. I'm going to do something similar, not really because I know yet it needs to be reusable, but because I find writing custom gradients inside Tailwind a little bit annoying if you want to do it directly as a class name. So I'm going to copy this gradient out and go to the Tailwind config, where we already have multiple background images for the gradients. And I'm going to add a new one, which we call radial faded. And this is then the radial gradient, which takes in a color variable, which we can set in a second, and then fades it out to transparent. So we can then add in before bg radial gradient. And we also need to set the custom variable, which we can do by using square brackets minus color, colon, and then the correct color we should have, which is this color. And that should add the custom property, which is then used in the background radial gradient. And it indeed sets the custom property, but our before element is still 0 width and 0 height. And of course, our gradient is not applied because we mistyped the name. And if we correct that, you already see that we also have the gradient applied here as well. So we still need to take in a few more styles from the pseudo element. And the main thing is the positioning. The linear team used the inset property, and inset actually combines the top, left, right, and bottom into one. So if you pick inset 0, it's actually on the top left corner. So we can use that as well by adding inset 0. And in order for that to apply, we are using position absolute on this pseudo element, but that means we need to add position relative to our wrapper as well. Because if we would not do that, it would be relative to God knows what. It's first pound that's relative, of course. I know. And if we do that, we already start seeing some sort of gradient appear. The next thing we still need to add in is the after element, which is the rounded circle. I think planet Earth, probably. Let's do that by adding another line in our class names, where we're going to add the after, which is also absolute. And it has a background color of 00212. which is our color background. So that's nice. After BG background. And it has a rounded of 50%, as well as a border top that is of a very specific color. So we're going to copy this RGB value. Let me zoom out for a second so you can see a bit more of the styles I'm applying. And we should not forget to add the after prefix, because otherwise it would apply it to the wrapping div. And also add a after of top half and left negative half. And this has a width of 200%. And final missing thing is a height for this after as well. They use an aspect ratio of 1 divided by 0.7, which is an option. But we could also use a height, which has exactly the same result. So if we divide 1 by 0.7, we get 1.428, or in this case, 142%, which could also be a route you take. So let's, in this case, add in a height instead of the aspect ratio to show that the result should be similar. After doing that, we see that we have a curved line on top of the stars, but the color of the line doesn't seem to be correct. And that is because we're using spaces in our border color, which is not allowed in Tailwind's arbitrary values. So we should actually replace this space with an underscore. And if we do that, we see that the color gets replaced. And you also notice that the linter actually sorted the class name now, because anything that's invalid will get moved to the front of the class names. And as soon as it's then valid, it moves to the correct place in the CSS build order. So that's also could be a hint if something is off. Excuse me for the brief interruption, but I really need to tell you about the Discord server I created. I have opened up my Discord server last week, and it's a paid server. Okay, calm. It's paid, but it costs $4.99 a month. And with that, I really hope to give you the ability to pick my brain and, like, in 2 minutes of your time, hopefully save you hours of going into the wrong rabbit hole, finding a certain bug, fixing stuff, and really make sure that I can dedicate time to helping you guys learn and grow. Whereas if it would be free, it would be something I would do on the side. But I really want to make sure that I can dedicate time for you. And that's why it has this price tag. So definitely check out the link below. If you join, I ensure you get your money back within 7 days. If you don't think I can solve a challenge you present me, or if you're just not satisfied in general, but definitely try it out. Join via the link below, and hopefully I will see you there. Back to building. So one thing that's probably still missing is some sort of mask, because our line get cut off at the end instead of smoothly fading out, which is something you see happen on Linear's page. So let's see if there is a mask added as well. If we comment that out, you see that everything becomes a lot brighter and that the line extends fully to the end. And what you also notice if we do that is that they're actually extending the full line until the far edge of the page instead of wrapping it inside a container. So let's also move our background outside of the container as well. So it extends the full width. And then, of course, we should copy in the mask image. Adding the mask image in Tailwind is actually not supported right now, as far as I know. So what we then have to do is actually go into our global styles and add our own utility in there, which we will, for example, call mask radial faded, where we will add in our own mask image. And after we've done that, we can copy this new utility class and apply it to our wrapper div. And if we do that, you see that everything gets nicely faded out. And Personally, I think the magic again is really in this type of mask that's applied, because the copy and pasting of this mask is pretty straightforward. But the fact to come up with this specific mask that really makes this image pop a lot more than when it would be really static like this, that's absolutely what makes a difference. And in my opinion, again, is credit to the designers at Linear. And that also wraps up this part. So next up is the section with all these really nice cards. It's a style you actually see a lot right now. I also saw it recently on Versailles' website and on their keynote, where they also had these blocks. And I feel it's kind of inspired by Apple's keynotes, where they also had all of these blocks, I think for years already. They're using that right now. But enough talking, let's keep on building. I've quickly taken a look throughout the rest of the website to see if combination of this title and text is used further down, and it feels like everything is kind of different. So for now, I'm not gonna abstract this into a reusable intro component or something like that. But we're just gonna stick with adding this custom in a component for now. And if later we notice we have to reuse this, we will abstract it then. That way we don't have too many separate components, which are actually only used once, which in my opinion would only make a bigger mess of your code instead of feeling neat or structured. What I am gonna do right now though is make a new folder inside components, which I'm gonna call sections. And inside sections, you can imagine that you would have directories for every different page. So the home page, but also other pages where you put in really page specific components. Since we are right now only building the home page, I will put all the home page components directly inside sections. But you can imagine if you were building a bigger project that you would divide that into subdirectories as well. So let's create our first section, which we call like any tool.tsx. And that has a component like any tool, which will return for now, for example, the H2 that has text unlike any tool you've used before. And that's then added in the page again inside another container. And while we're at it, making new directories, I'm also moving the clients inside the sections for now, because for now it's only used in display. So it's a section on the homepage instead of a reusable component. So let's move that in there and change the import as well. And also update these imports. And I'm also gonna copy this hero component, this section, and make a homepage hero.tsx. Add all of the missing imports again, and then add the homepage hero in, and then use the organize imports to clean everything up. And that would still give us the exact same page, but the nice thing is everything is a bit easier to scan right now. And if you're looking for specific homepage sections, they're right now inside the sections directory or in a bigger project inside sections/homepage. And I hope you don't get annoyed by me constantly refactoring things, but this really shows you how I build a project. It's not that the full picture is in my mind when I start, but while I'm building, I constantly keep thinking, is there anything that I can improve pretty easily, but will drastically improve either the end result or the quality or the structure of the code? This is really something you should keep thinking about constantly while building anything. So let's get back to the unlike any tool you've ever used before. Let's start by adding in that title, which has a font size of 36. So if we look at our Tailwind config, that's not the size we currently have. And I'm wondering if that's even a size that's used more often. Because when we checked the site before, I believe that was not the case. So for now, I'm going to stick with defining this inline as class name is text 3.2 rem. And I'm also going to add a wrapper div with a class name of text white and zoom in a little bit again for you. And then on desktop, we have the size 56 pixels, which also seems to be a very custom size that's not used anywhere else. So we're also going to define that as an arbitrary value for now. And of course, we need to add a breakpoint. And in my opinion, you should try to add as little as possible custom values in your Tailwind class names, of course. But you should also not make a variable out of everything. Most of the time, it's either a really rare case where it's a one-time use, but often it could also mean that you should reevaluate the config you have and see if you either should use a different value for this size or if you need to add it to your team because it's used more throughout the site. But if this is the value you take from design, it could also be the case that there's a little inconsistency in the design. And if it's only used once, it might be wise to discuss with a designer and see if, for example, it should be 3.2 REM and 4.8, because those are actually values that are already in the team, especially if it's only used once in this component. So perhaps we should, in this case, act like we've talked with the designer and actually use values that are currently in there. Oh, and I added 3.2, but it was 3.6, right? Yeah. So let's add in the 4XL as well as the 7XL to get rid of those arbitrary values. Next is also on this text, which we'll add as a paragraph, and it has a color of primary text, primary text. And then on mobile, it is a font size of 18 pixels, which is our large, text large. And on the bigger breakpoint, it's 22, which is our extra large again. And then for now, I'm going to add another wrapper around this, which will center the text, because later we also have a wrapper div for these components down below. So that's why I already decided to add this wrapper div. And after we've added that in, you see that our text kind of has a gradient overlay, which is probably the gradient that's on top of the earth. So let's see. Yeah. That also already makes it so that we cannot really interact with this text anymore. So I want to do two things, which is first, we're going to add pointer events none. So that way we can select it already. It should also probably have a z-index of -1, because this way it will be underneath all of the text instead of on top of it. And then you see that our text already is fully visible. Also, there's probably a max width on this text. Yes, kinda. And the line break again. Guys, they want to have exact line breaks. Crazy. So let's first add in that line break again. Gives us a class name of hidden and block. No, inline block on medium and up. So that way the title already looks proper. And then we add in the max width of 680 pixels on the main text. And then we add in the max width of 680 pixels on the text. And then, of course, we need to add in the margin X of auto that centers it. And then there's some margin on the title. So the margin is 18 pixels on mobile, and on desktop it's 28 pixels. So that means we're going to add a margin bottom of 4, which is 16 instead of 18, but it's a variable we have. And on medium and up, we're going to make it margin bottom of 7, which is 28. And we're also going to add that to the paragraph. And with that, we already see that we have the proper margin, and we can finally start building the other components underneath it, these ones. First, start by adding another wrapper div in here. That probably will be display flags in a second. And then we're going to add 4 divs with the content. And if we look at these blocks, we see that the first one has a span of 4. And the second one has a span of 2. So that means that together they're 6. So this is 2/3 and this is 1/3. So for now, we're gonna add flex on this one, as well as flex wrap. And we make sure to check the gap, which is 24 pixels. So that's a gap 6, which we will also add in. So if we look, then we already see that they're spaced out evenly. And then I also want to add in this background already, which is a gradient. So we still have to define that custom gradient. So we go to our Tailwind config and add in a new gradient. And you see how detailed their design is, looking at the amount of gradients we already had to define. So we call that a gloss gradient, for example. And with that, we can go back to our divs and add class name is bg gloss gradient, as well as probably some padding. Yeah, padding of 56 pixels on desktop. And on mobile, they're adding a padding of 32 pixels. So that means that we can add a padding of 8 on mobile, and on medium and up, a padding of 14, which is not something we have defined yet, since we only go to 12. Let's add those in as well. 13 and 14.2 and 5.6. And that already gives us a background with padding. Then we also need to add in the border, which is transparent white, border and border transparent white, as well as a border radius of 48 pixels, and on mobile also 48 pixels, which is rounded of 4.8 rem. Perfect. And then we still need to set the width of these different blocks, which, because we're using Flexbox, can use flex bases for. So we can set bases of 2/3 in this case, for example, which makes it 2/3 the width. But again, if we would add flex bases 1/3 to the second one, it would flow to the next line because there's the gap in between. So what we need to do again is use calc 66.66% minus 12 pixels. And the same thing we do for the 1/3, which is also calc of 33.33% minus 12 pixels. And that puts them right next to each other. And of course, you can argue that you don't like these calcs, and that might be a very valid reason. And that could for you be a reason to use CSS Grid as well. Absolutely choose whatever suits you, because these calculations are prone to breaking, of course, especially if you don't use any CSS variable or something like that. If you change this gap to 8, it will break again. So it could be a very valid reason to use CSS Grid instead. Same thing we do for the next blocks. And with that, we already have our blocks positioned correctly. So now first, let's add in the rest of the content and make sure that they're styled properly. Okay, let's see what the font sizes of these main titles is. 26 pixels, which is 3XL. And on desktop, they stay 26 pixels. So let's add that into the other ones as well. We could, of course, decide to do this in some sort of loop or style the parent or something like that to not repeat these styles. But since it's not that many and they're located quite close together, I'm going to stick with repeating that for now, because abstracting this into a loop of some sort also becomes quite complicated when we want to add in these child components. And then we have this subtext, which is 16 pixels and on mobile as well. So that's our text medium, as well as text, primary text for the color. And then we copy it to the other text as well. And then I also just now noticed I wrote 3XL, which of course should be text 3XL. That already gives us the proper styling for the text. The text is also centered. So let's also add that in. So it's centered. And that brings us to adding in these custom components. And of course, probably some details down the line, but let's first add in some nice components. I will start with the easier ones, which are these illustrations. The first one is an SVG, which I'm gonna make a new directory called illustrations. And we're gonna add them in there actually. Okay, and then paste that one in there. Wow, this is also a big SVG again. Let's remove these inline styles because probably need to build something for that ourselves. And let's first render this thing to see how it looks. It did add in a fixed width and height for this SVG. So let's add in some custom styling for this already, so it won't grow outside the parent. You can do that by adding SVG and then max width, cool, colon. And then for the height, we're gonna add in height auto. And in order to have this SVG scaled properly, we need to add in the view box as well, which is not included in the SVG on Linear's website. So we add in a 00 as a start for the coordinates of the view box, and then a width of 425 and a height of 518. And if we do that, the SVG properly scales according to the width and height that we're setting. If we look at Linear's website, you see that they actually blow it up a little bit instead of fixing it within the boundaries, but that's something we can do right now. If we look at Linear's website, we see that they have added position absolute to the wrapper of this SVG and gave it a top of minus 92 pixels. So if we try to replicate that, we have to give our wrapper position relative and then give the wrapper of the SVG position absolute and the top of minus 9.2 REM. And we also need to copy in the mask image that's applied. This is also something we need to add to our globals, like we did with the radial mask. So let's for now call this mask linear faded. And then we hope that this one is reused as well. So this way we can add the mask linear faded on our wrapper as well. And with that, we already see that it fades out. But because it's position absolute, the text has also moved up. And what Linear actually did is they gave the wrapper a min height. So this way, at least all of the content is pushed towards the bottom. So we can do the same for our divs by selecting all three of them and giving them a min height of 48 REM. And that should not be min height, but min h. Okay. And if we then also make the wrappers flex and flex column, and after that we add in justify end, that will push all of the content down to the bottom, except the second one because I did not select it properly. So flex, flex call, and justify end. So now that will also push that one down as well. And now our SVG is position absolute. We should actually make the SVG bigger as well. So it should be the full 425 pixels as a width. So I'm actually going to remove our custom width and height and use the attributes that are set on the SVG, which will give it the correct sizing, but not the correct position yet. The items still need to be centered, for which we can use items center on this specific one, which will make sure that everything is centered in the middle instead of being offset what you saw with the SVG before. The only thing that is lacking still is the really nice animation. When we copied the SVG in, we already saw that they had these inline indexes defined. And they're actually using that index in a really neat way to add a custom animation delay based on this index. So that way the animation delay is multiplied by 20 milliseconds. So every line has its own delay, which is actually a really smart thing. So let's go back to our illustration and add in those custom index variables as well. So let's select all of these strokes, and then add in the style attribute where we are going to set the index for now, all of them as 0, and also add as react.css properties. So it actually accepts a definition of the style property with custom variables. Okay, now comes the boring part. Let's make this go up by 1. Okay, and I'm gonna add a class name on this. So let's select them all again. And then add a class name, which we call animate zap, for example. And that animation is what we're gonna add to our Tailwind config next. First, we need to define the keyframes, which we call zap. And if we inspect one element, we can see the definition of the keyframes at the bottom. And then we also need to add in the animation, which we will also call zap. That runs the zap keyframes. And then has a duration 20 to 50 milliseconds, and the delay where they use the calc and then the index variable times 20 milliseconds, which goes infinite in a linear way. And if we then go back, we already see that the animation is running. So based on the index, it is setting a delay to fade in and fade out every line one by one at a different interval. Really, really great work by the linear team again. So the next one is this third icon where they've also added an SVG. So let's copy that into our illustrations directory as well. And then we're also going to render that and then wrap that in a div. So we can make this SVG as well, position absolute, which means the parent needs to become relative again, and give it a top of -8 rem and a width of 130%. And if we do that, we see that it's still not aligned in the center. And that's because also for this column, we need to add items center. And probably while doing that, we can do it for all of the columns because I guess it's necessary everywhere. And the final thing that needs to happen is if you hover this block, there is a link popping up actually. So let's also add that in. Let's first add in the link, which has a text product principles, and then it's position absolute and at 200 pixels from the bottom. So let's add in that class name as well. Absolute bottom 20 rem. And then by default, it is opacity 0. And it has a translate Y of 30% and the scale of 0.8. And then as soon as you hover this block, it should become visible. So what we can do in Tailwind for that is add a group class name on the wrapper div. And then we can add another class, group hover. And then we can say opacity 1. And also group hover transform none. And with that, as soon as we hover the parent, you see that the button becomes visible. The only thing missing, of course, is a transition. And that transition we can add in by adding transition and then square bracket, transform, comma, opacity. This makes the transition on both the transform and opacity properties with the default transition values, which for now are good enough. And if you then hover, you already see that the element fades in. The only thing you notice is that the hover state somehow extends a little bit further. As soon as I get close to the element, it already fades in. And that is because this SVG is actually 130% like we defined. So it extends a little bit beyond its wrapper. So what we can do to prevent this is adding pointer events none to this SVG container. This way, its pointer events are ignored, so it won't trigger the hover state of the group. Only once we get into the wrapper, it will fade in the button. But if we look at this button, we still see that there's also an icon inside the button, which is actually an SVG. For now, I'm going to add this SVG as a child to our button because it's not reused anywhere yet. So I'm going to assume that this is like a one-time use case. So it does not make sense to make a custom component or prop. And using children props actually makes it way more flexible in reusing, putting the icon in front at the end instead of having props. So if we paste in that SVG, and then we need to add in a class name as well to give it a margin left of 1. And then we already see that the icon is there. The only thing missing still is this prefix text. And for that, we have a icon wrapper component which actually does exactly this, because we have also used it at the top of the page. So instead of naming it icon wrapper, I think we should rename it to something more useful. So for the lack of better naming, I'm gonna call this highlight instead of icon wrapper. So let's make this highlight. And then this should also become highlight. And we also need to place any instance of icon wrapper in the class names as well. Make that highlight as well. And then of course we need to find all of the icon wrappers we are already using, which is only one. That's good. And make that highlight. So those are still working. That's good. And then we can add in the highlight in our button as well. And copy in the proper text, which is linear method. And of course, we still need to set the size equal to small. And then we see that it still doesn't fit in the button. And that is probably because we are using not the exact same font linear uses. So this is actually a little bit too large. So what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to actually make this highlight a little bit smaller in font size. So at least the text fits on one line. And the next thing you then notice is that the text is actually directly attached to each other instead of having spacing between the two parts. And that is because before we had this element on the right side and not on the left side. So if we go to our button component and scroll a bit to the right, we see that we set a margin left of 2 and a margin right of -2 on the highlight component. But this should only be the case when the highlight component is on the right side of the element, not when it's on the left side. Then it should actually be inversed. So what we can do is actually add a last child selector to our highlight, as well as on the right side, which will already remove it here. But then we should also duplicate this and add the reverse to the first child. So let's make first child. That should be a negative margin left and a positive margin right of 2. Nice. And with that, you see that the highlight is now also positioned correctly when it's on the left side. And even if it's on the right side, it's also still correct. The last thing I still want to do before we wrap up this video is also make sure that this works on mobile as well. Because right now, if we scale our browser, it's just horrible, right? So if we look at Linear's website, what they actually do on mobile is they put everything in one column and then give you the option to scroll through it. And for that, I actually released a really nice video not that long ago, because for this, we can use CSS scroll snapping. Check the video up here if you haven't seen it before, because it's really nice. And it's also a pretty fast option for us to make this work. So let's do that right away. If we go back to our component, that means that all of the flags bases are actually only applying on medium and up. So that's the first thing I want to get rid of. And that means that they're actually of full width. And then the flags wrap also only applies from medium and up. And then we add in an overflow X of auto and add a flex shrink to all of our diffs, shrink 0. And that will already put all of them as full width elements on the page. The only thing we now still need to add in is the scroll snapping, so we're not able to stop them halfway. And that we can do by going to our wrapper component and adding snap X as well as snap mandatory. And then go to all our different slides. And we can select them by selecting the min height because all of them have that. And then add in snap center. And if we do that, we can now drag each block and see if we didn't scroll past the center, it will go back. And if we go to the next one, it will snap to the next, or the previous, or the one before, or the one before, which is super nice. Only thing you see is because we have this slider wrapped inside a parent that has overflow, you see that the right edge of the carousel is currently cut off. So that's something we still need to take on in the next video. But at least on mobile, this is already looking decent now. Or, I mean, it's at least usable. And that brings us to the end of this video. And if we look at what we've made already, I mean, there's again so many details that are added in and it's looking really, really nice. All of these great colors, all of these great animations, it's looking super nice. And I cannot keep on repeating this enough. All thanks to the credits of the linear team, of course. The design part, in my opinion, is the most important step. And from that point on, if you know how to build things, we can build them as front-end engineers, but you need to have these great designers on your team to come up with these ideas. So in the next video, we will also be adding these interactive elements from Linea's website, which are actually super fun to build. So really make sure to keep your notifications on to receive a notification when that goes live, which hopefully will be next week already. And also be sure to check out the link in the description below, because recently I opened up a Discord channel as well, and it's a paid Discord channel. By making the Discord channel paid, $4.99 a month, I am able to dedicate the time to really help you learn and grow, whereas otherwise it might be something that I would do on the side. And I am really excited to help you answer all the questions you have, giving you the option to pick my brain, try to discuss any topic you want, and hopefully even within 2 minutes of my time, I might be able to save you hours of research or going into the wrong rabbit hole. So definitely check out the Discord. I also offer a 7-day money back, so you can challenge me with the right questions and see if I am helpful to you, because I know I am, but let's challenge me. Also, links to everything we build again in the description as well. And I wish everyone who celebrates a happy holiday, and I'll see you in the next video.